Hi, MSC friends. We're going to start reading a book about the composer Beethoven. This year is a special year because in December we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of his birth. Now his exact date of birth isn't known, but we do know that he was baptized on December 17th, 1770. And that's the day that we'll be celebrating his 250th birthday. We're going to start with this book called Ludwig Beethoven and the Chiming Bell Towers by Opal Wheeler. This is the same author who wrote the book we read last year, Joseph Haydn, The Merry Little Peasant. So it's going to be similar. It starts at his childhood and goes through his adulthood. So let's start. Chapter 1. The good folk of the quaint city of Bonn hurried into their tall, pointed houses and locked the doors tightly against the bitter December thunderstorm that beat suddenly down upon them from the seven mountains. The icy wind tore at the shutters and howled in the chimneys, racing on through the valley of the Rhine to churn the waters of the old river into foam and toss the ferry boat on the high, white-capped waves. Grandfather Beethoven stood on the deck with the captain, his old red coat pulled close around his broad shoulders against the driving rain. "A bad night ahead, Captain." "Aye, and not another crossing for us this day." Soon the struggling ferry was landed at the wide pier of Bonn, nestling safely at the foothills of the mountains. Grandfather Beethoven stepped ashore and tramped through the wet cobbled streets, stopping now and then to look in the windows of his good neighbors, gathered snugly around their crackling hearth fires. The Bongasse at last, opening the low green gate, he crossed the small garden and slowly climbed the long back stairs to the attic rooms at the top. How cold it was in the poor three-roomed home of his son. As he softly closed the door, a flash of lightning made the tiny bedroom as bright as day. A crash of thunder shook the walls, and a baby cried lustily in the dark. "Ah, my good Maria, the little one is here?" "Yes, grandfather, and you will see what a fine boy he is too," answered Mother Beethoven softly. Lighting a candle, Grandfather Louis bent over the old worn bed and looked for a long time at his new grandson. "He is not a pretty baby, Maria, but he makes a good noise. Perhaps he will be a fine singer someday like his grandfather." Here's a picture. As the thunder growled and the wind beat through the cracks in the window, the wailing grew louder than ever. "There, there, my little one, do not cry so," crooned Mother Beethoven, tucking the coverlet closer around the small baby. Grandfather Beethoven hurried to his home across the street and was soon climbing the stairs again, his arms piled high with wood. Before long, the fires were blazing cheerily, and the new baby, warm at last, fell fast asleep beside his mother. Early the next morning, Father Beethoven carried his son to the stone-cold church of St. Remigius nearby, where he christened Ludwig von Beethoven. In the months that quickly went by, little Ludwig heard music much of the time, for Father Beethoven was a singer in the royal choir at the Elector's palace and gave lessons on the violin and piano to the children of noble families. There were many concerts in the low attic rooms when the neighbors of the Bongasse gathered together to play on their instruments with Father Beethoven until far into the night. But the best time of all was early in the morning when Grandfather Beethoven came to visit his small grandson. "Sing, sing," called the brown-skinned, black-haired little Ludwig, as Grandfather Louis in his deep voice began the songs that he had sung so many years ago in the royal choir. The small boy waved his arms in time to the singing. "Just see this child, Johann. He does not miss a single beat." "Yes, Father. Perhaps he too will become a musician, like all the Beethovens." As soon as Ludwig was old enough to run about on his short, stocky legs. He was seldom at home, for every morning, almost as soon as he opened his big black eyes, he ran across the street to look for Grandfather Beethoven. "Ludwig, so early you are, little one, just like the sparrows." After they had eaten their simple meal of sausage and bread, they wandered happily through the busy market square and on back to the narrow Bongasse to chat with their good neighbors along the way. So here are two pictures. Always there was music, for almost everyone along the cobbled street played an instrument. And Ludwig's dark eyes grew wide with wonder as Herr Ries gently drew the bow across the strings of his violin, or as Simrock blew into his long golden horn, the lovely melodies filling all of the sunlit air. In the springtime, there were long walks beyond the old city walls, when Ludwig ran happily about in the sweet-smelling meadows. When he grew tired, Grandfather Beethoven swung him high onto his broad shoulder and sang him songs of long ago, his deep voice ringing out through the wide valley. And there were stories of the time when he had journeyed all the way from his home in Holland to earn his living as a choir boy in the little city of Bonn, and there, at last, he had become the well-known Kapellmeister, loved by everyone, far and near. Ludwig loved the days with his grandfather, who was always so kind and took such good care of him. But the happy times could not go on, for one day, Grandfather Beethoven died. Ludwig was very lonely now, and sadly missed his gentle companion more and more as the days went slowly by. And there were times when he was cold and hungry, for Grandfather Louis was no longer there to bring him food to eat and fuel to keep the fires burning brightly. Before going to his work each morning, Father Beethoven sat to play at the old worn piano, while Ludwig stood close by watching his flying fingers and listening eagerly to the beautiful sounds. Father Beethoven looked down at the small boy standing there so still. "Come, my son, now it is time to see what you can do with music." And lifting the 4-year-old Ludwig to his knees, he watched quietly as the short fingers pressed down the keys very gently, picking out a little melody that he had just heard. Father Beethoven was delighted. "Ah, yes, it is time for us to work together, my child. And when you can play well, you will give a fine concert, like the boy Mozart, and bring us much money and costly presents as well." Ludwig learned very quickly, and Father Beethoven was proud, indeed, when the little boy was able to play the difficult accompaniments of his songs, while he sang the solos in his high tenor voice. The neighbors gathered around the piano, listening in amazement. "Bravo, bravo, little musician! Surely he will be another Mozart someday." And now there were lessons on the violin as well. Ludwig liked to work with Father Beethoven, but when the pieces became more difficult and the hours of the practicing were longer, he grew very weary. "I will learn to play when I am older, Father." "No, my son. Now is the good time to study music." Here's a picture of him at the piano with Father Beethoven. Sometimes Ludwig played in the garden below with the neighbor children, but he could never stay for long, for there was always the practicing to be done. Mother Beethoven watched sadly as the small boy stood on a low stool before the piano, playing difficult scales and exercises hour after hour, or drawing the bow across the strings of his small violin until the tones were sure and true. "Ah, my little one, it is enough now. There is the water to get, for Father will soon be here, and no supper is ready." "I will draw it for you, Mother," cried the delighted Ludwig, delighted and happy to be free at last. Running to the garden below, he pushed the long pump handle that brought the water rushing from the spout.